today we're joined by Madison Struba, Program Development Coordinator at the Invasive Species Center. In her role, Madison is focused on training and outreach, particularly on forest and agricultural pests. So in this webinar today, Madison will be discussing community science, what it is, how it's used in invasive species prevention and management, and practical ways which you can contribute to community science efforts locally, nationally, and beyond. Madison, you should be able to share your screen now. I mean, you already are, but you can take your presentation away if you'd like.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much, Allison. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here talking to you about community science. So yeah, you said you can see my screen, so all set to go here. Awesome. Okay. There we go. Okay. So just in case you aren't familiar with us, I'm with the Invasive Species Center, and we're a not-for-profit organization that mobilizes action against invasive species that harm the environment, economy, and society. So we do this in a number of different ways. For example, we have a grant program that funds on-the-ground action. We host events ourselves. We also attend conferences and participate in outreach, just like this webinar today. So our head office is located in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, but we do have team members kind of scattered all throughout the province. For example, I'm speaking to you today from Windsor. So let's first just talk about the definition of an invasive species. That way we're all on the same page. So something is considered invasive when it meets two basic criteria. So the first is that it's introduced to an ecosystem outside of its native range. And the second is that it has the potential to cause ecological, economic, and social harm in this new area. So just because a species is introduced to a new area doesn't automatically mean it's invasive. Sometimes species get brought over here and they're just not compatible with this new environment. Maybe it's too cold or there's not enough food, so they aren't able to establish and spread here. There are other times when species get brought over and they actually integrate really well and don't pose a risk to the environment like invasives do. So an example that comes to mind for this would be food crops like wheat or corn. They were introduced here intentionally and they've had some sort of positive impact. Like a lot of us really rely on those food sources now. So just because a species isn't from here doesn't mean it's invasive. It really does have to cause harm in some way. So invasive species tend to have a few characteristics that make them really good at establishing and spreading in new environments. The first is that they tend to be really fast growing and reproducing species. Invasive plants are a really great example of this. So they usually open their green leaves sooner in the season than native plants do, so they're able to grow faster and grow over a longer period of time. They're also able to release hundreds or even thousands of seeds all at once that can be spread really easily and effectively. Invasive species also tend to lack natural predators that would slow their spread and tend to target native species that lack defense mechanisms. So these characteristics really help their populations grow rapidly because there's nothing really stopping them or feeding on them over here. The fourth shared characteristic is that these invasive species tend to have an increased tolerance and adaptive capacity in these new conditions. So they do really well in these new environments from what they're completely not used to at all. So a good example of this would be invasive insects like the emerald ash borer right there. This came from somewhere warm, like in Asia, and they're able to survive these much colder conditions here than they're used to surviving back home. So they're just really good at adapting. Invasive species can come from anywhere in the world. They can come from further away, like in Europe or Asia, or they can even come from parts of Canada. So, for example, a species can be native to British Columbia on the west coast, but then spread over here in the east and become invasive. So, this is happening with an insect called the mountain pine beetle. So, the mountain pine beetle is native to areas in the west, but because of climate change, they're actually able to start spreading out of that area. And there's a big concern that they're making their way over here and that they could become invasive in Ontario and be a threat to the pine forests here. So a lot of species have come and settled in Ontario. We're actually a pretty big hotspot for invasive species and have more on here in Ontario than really any other province or territory in Canada. And this is for a few different reasons. The first is that there's just a lot of activity with commercial and recreational boats. We're really close to the Great Lakes, so water is a really big pathway for the spread of invasive species. There's a lot of different plants and aquatic species that can hitchhike in boats, like in the ballast water, for example. So that's a really big concern. We also have a lot of international travel and trade between Canada and the US, so there's lots of potential for invasives to arrive here accidentally on trucks or in cargo. Some insects are really good at hitchhiking. So there's one called the spotted lanternfly, and it's currently found in the US, but not here in Canada. And this insect is really good at clinging onto vehicles and laying egg masses really anywhere. So there's a really big risk of bringing them over here after you visit different parts of the US. Ontario is also a hotspot because of our diverse geography. So Ontario has lots of different types of environments. We have forests like the boreal forest in the north and the Carolinian forest in the south. So invasives really have a lot of different choices for where they can really start to establish. The Carolinian zone is circled there in red just because it's a really important part of the province. This is where we have a lot of deciduous forests with rare plants and animals. It also tends to be warmer and more humid here in the south, so really just good ideal conditions to support biodiversity. There's also high populations of us humans in this area. We have a lot of big cities like Toronto, Windsor, for example. So this area is particularly vulnerable to invasive species introductions and spread. So invasive species are a pretty big problem, unfortunately. They actually are one of the 5 major drivers of biodiversity loss. Thankfully, it's not all bad because there are a few ways that we can get involved and make a difference. And a really important part of that invasive species prevention and action is community science. So community science basically helps increase collaboration by connecting members of the public with professionals like researchers or government officials. And it really allows you to provide data or information to people who can actually make decisions on invasive species policies or to people that are actually on the ground managing invasive species. So community science really just, a lot of collaboration. It really connects everybody together. So I really want to dive into just a few of the different ways you can actively get involved as a community scientist. Absolutely anybody can be a community scientist. You don't need any sort of prior knowledge or courses or anything like that. All you really need is a love of nature. And so one of the best ways you can get actively involved in invasive species prevention is to learn how to identify and report invasive species. Reporting invasive species is really important. Community scientists are often the first ones to discover new invasives and actually make that first report. So one example actually is of emerald ash borer in British Columbia. Someone was just sitting outside and literally felt the bug fall onto their head. And this person thought it was a cool insect, so they looked it up, realized it was a highly invasive species, and made a report. That report sent government inspectors out. They responded to it. They went out to that area and they found an infestation that they may not have found otherwise without that first report. So the more people that know about the invasive species means we have more people out paying attention and looking for them. This increased monitoring can really lead to early detection of new invasives, which can initiate rapid responses. So we've seen this happen a few times. One example is with oak wilt. So oak wilt is a tree disease. It's caused by an invasive fungus, and it was found for the very first time in Canada last year. We've been working really hard to try and spread the word about this disease so that people know exactly what to look for. And thankfully, the first person that did find it knew what it was and reported it. And because of this first report and because we found it so quickly, we were able to act fast and remove it all from the area. So it's looking pretty good for oak wilt. It looks like we may be able to actually eradicate it here from Canada and protect all of the oaks that we have here. So community scientists play a really key role in finding invasive species early. This graph really just emphasizes the importance of early detection. So this is an invasion curve, and it shows that prevention really is the most cost-effective solution when managing for invasive species. So we can see here that when a species first arrives, it can be relatively easy to control if you catch it early. But if invasive species go unnoticed or unmanaged, then population sizes can grow really rapidly. It's really hard to contain, and then eventually all you have is long-term control, and that can be quite costly. So if we want to catch invasives early and prevent their spread, we need to report what we see. So EDMAPS is a really great tool for reporting and tracking invasive species. It stands for the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. We recommend this one a lot. It shows the real-time tracking of invasive species and pest occurrences. So what will happen is a member of the public, like yourself, will see something that you maybe think is invasive. You'll take a picture and send a report. That report gets verified by experts and then posted publicly for everybody to see. So you can really report invasives through EDMAPS on the computer or through an app. It's pretty easy to use. So let's say you're out and about on a walk through your neighborhood, enjoying the nice weather, and you happen to look up and see beech leaf disease. We'll talk about what beech leaf disease is a little bit more later, but based on this talk, you'll know that it's invasive and that you should make a report. So let's go over how you'd actually do that. So if you see something suspicious, you'll pull up EdMaps on your computer or by going to edmaps.org, or even better, you'll just open up the app on your phone. There's a few different things you can look at through in EdMaps. You'll see along the top here. But if you have an invasive species observation, you'll click on Report Sightings. And then it'll ask you what type of invasive species you're actually reporting. So with the case of beech leaf disease, it's caused by an invasive nematode. So we would click on fungi and diseases. And then it'll just ask you to fill out a lot of information, the type of species that it is that you think it is, the location of the finding, and some pictures. The more information and photos you can provide, the better. It'll just help the verifiers confirm or not confirm the report. So when you're done filling all the information out, you hit submit. And then that report gets sent to an expert. So they'll review all the information you submitted and confirm whether or not it's invasive. Once it's been positively confirmed by an expert, that observation will be uploaded to the site and become publicly available. So it's a really great way, again, just to share some information and get an idea of where different invasive species are. The timelines for this expert verification can really vary depending on the species, but high priority species are typically looked at really quickly. I submitted what I thought was maybe oak wills a few years ago, and thankfully it wasn't, but because it's such a high priority species, I heard back in like 2 hours. So the reports are monitored quite well. So once those reports goes public, it'll show up on this distribution map, something like this that you see here on the right. It's a really cool way to visually see where different reports are, but what good does it actually do? There thankfully are a ton of different ways that this information can be useful. So for example, it can be used by professionals to help select sites for management. It can help identify areas where we need to focus more training and outreach. And it can also be used by researchers to identify changes in distribution. So these distribution maps give us a really good idea of where species might be, but it definitely isn't an exhaustive list of everywhere where they definitely are found. It just gives us a good idea. But this is all based on public reports. So the more reports we have, the more accurate we can make this distribution map. There are so many examples of when reporting made a positive impact, but one of the biggest examples here in Ontario would be Asian longhorn beetle. So this beetle is a wood-boring beetle that's native to Asia, but it was introduced accidentally to North America on infested wood packaging material. They have several different host trees that they rely on for survival and reproduction, but their favorite seems to be maple, willow, poplar, and birch. These trees are really important to us in our ecosystem. Maple trees, as you know, are a really big symbol here in Canada. So if these beetles were to establish here, they could really wipe out these trees and make a really nasty impact. These beetles were found in Canada and was reported by a member of the public in 2003 and in 2013. So in 2003, an individual found this beetle on their car at work and actually just gave it to their supervisor as a gift. Interesting gift. The supervisor brought it home because he thought it could be a cool addition to his child's science project. So while he was doing some research on the insect, he found a ton of messaging from the United States talking about how it's really invasive and needs to be reported. So this person, the supervisor, did report it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which might sound funny just based on the name because you wouldn't really think that this organization deals with invasive species, but they do handle all the different priority species that could have an impact on plant health. So that's why they're the ones that we go to. So once the Canadian Food Inspection Agency confirmed it was Asian longhorn beetle, they initiated action with the help of several partners and tons of teamwork. Asian longhorn beetle was deemed eradicated in 2020. So we haven't come across it yet since then. But it really does show that one person's report was able to save an enormously large amount of trees here in Ontario. So it really did. Reporting does make a huge difference. Another quick example is spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive insect that I've talked about briefly before. It's not currently found here in Ontario. This insect really likes fruits and grapes and could really impact the agricultural sector here in Ontario and in Canada in general. Someone posted this picture online with the caption, "Weird beetle found in Mississauga." And people immediately recognize this as spotted lanternfly. And so there's a lot of activity online with people sharing this post to the point where government officials started to see what was going on and started to make plans to act. There's a ton of response. People were really concerned. And thankfully, it turned out later that this was just a giant misunderstanding. This picture wasn't actually taken here in Ontario, thankfully. But it shows that that one report, that one photo online did have a big impact. It triggered some serious collaborative action. So as a community scientist, you can learn how to identify and report invasives, but another thing you can do is try to prevent the spread. So sometimes our prevention strategies can be quite specific to a species, but we do have some general tips that work really well to prevent the spread of invasive species. So the first is to brush off your boots or your shoes after walking in an area with invasive species. So when you're done hiking or walking through a park, just give your shoes a little cleaning. It doesn't have to be crazy, just carry a little brush with you. A lot of invasive seeds or insects can be on the ground and get caught up in the mud that sticks to your shoes. So if you don't clean that off, you can be spreading them with you when you leave. If you have a pet, like if you're walking your dog, for example, you can give them a little brushing as well. Sometimes we recommend for different species like Hemlock woolly adelgid, which we'll talk about later, we recommend things like lint rollers to clean off your clothing. You can roll off your pet and your hair, things like that, because they can kind of stick to your clothing. So just some general tips there. The second biggest tip here is to not move firewood. So there's a lot of different insects and fungi that can live under the bark. So you really never know what's hiding underneath there. You could be accidentally transporting invasives if you transport that firewood. So don't pack firewood at home and then bring it with you several hours away if you go camping. So if you're camping with your family or with your friends, just please remember to burn where you buy. The third tip I have here on the screen is to not dump any yard clippings. So sometimes people are really well intentioned and they'll decide to throw their grass clippings or their used plants, yard waste, things like that in fields or parks, thinking that it'll just kind of degrade. But really, you could be introducing seeds or other little invasive plants into the area. So just something to keep in mind if you like to garden with your family or anything like that. So another way you can become a community scientist is to monitor for invasives. So if you're out walking around your neighborhood, just take a look around every once in a while and monitor the health of the trees around you. So look for things out of the ordinary, like rapid tree decline or clusters of egg masses, things like that. You can also pay attention to the healthy trees because it's just as important to know which ones are healthy as it is to know which ones may be infected. So we actually have a few programs at the Invasive Species Center dedicated solely to monitoring invasive species. So these programs are our monitoring networks, which are really just made up of volunteer community scientists that want to look for and report invasive species. So the first one here is our Hemlock woolly adelgid monitoring network. This network is more for municipalities and property owners, but I really wanted to show you this one as a positive example of what can happen when we monitor forest health. So before we get into the actual monitoring, I thought we should talk about what this insect even is. So this is Hemlock woolly adelgid. It's a sap-sucking insect that infests and kills hemlock trees. They're really tiny and hard to see without some sort of magnification. So what you're actually likely to see are these white ovisacs where they keep their eggs. They kind of look like little clumps of snow, little cotton balls. So if you're walking through a hemlock stand, they'll tend to be on the bottom of the branches. So as you're walking, you can just flip over the branches and see if you can see any of these clusters. You can see there's a pretty big difference here between an early and late infestation. So in the top picture, it's really hard to see those white ovisacs. They're circled in red because there's only a few adelgids on this branch. Like if you're walking through the forest, you probably wouldn't see that. I know I wouldn't see that, but it does become easier to see when there's more of them, obviously, like this larger, more infested branch down here in the second picture. We can see the ovisacs more clearly here too. This is a very heavily infested twig. You can see that you'll only ever see the ovisacs along the twig, along the base of the needles. You won't ever see them forming on the actual needles themselves. You know by the name that this insect only ever feeds on hemlock trees. And if you're wondering whether the tree you're looking at is a hemlock, you can look at those needles themselves. So hemlock needles are quite flat, so they're really difficult to roll in your fingers. Another key characteristic are those parallel white lines on the underside of the needles. So this is a map comparing the native range of hemlock trees with the spread of Hemlock woolly adelgid. So the green is the native range of eastern hemlock, and the burgundy color is the spread of this invasive insect. So we can see that Hemlock woolly adelgid has become quite widespread in the States, spreading throughout most of its native range. In Canada, we've seen this insect in Nova Scotia and here in Ontario. It's a little bit more widespread in Nova Scotia just because it's been there for longer, but we have been finding more and more reports of it here in Ontario. So just a little history of the insect here in Ontario. It was first found here in 2013, but from 2013 to 2021, it was relatively isolated in the Niagara region. You can see a lot of the reports here are kind of clustered. But 2022 was concerning. That's the color in that bright blue color. And that's because we found a detection of Hemlock woolly adelgid up further than any of the other detections. It was found on the north shore of Lake Ontario near Cobourg. And we're not positive how it got there, but there's likely to be because of birds. So this is a really important corridor for migratory birds. So they do tend to stop over in the Niagara region to rest and then fly away to carry on with their journey. And those white woolly ovisacs that we saw in those other pictures there, they kind of stick to the bird's feathers like Velcro. So if a bird rests on an affected tree and picks up those insects, it can accidentally introduce them to new areas when they fly away and land elsewhere. A fun fact about this insect too is they are all females. They don't need a male to reproduce, so it only really takes a few little adelgids in a new area to start an entirely new population. Unfortunately, we've been consistently making new detections each year, so you can see the red stars there. These are the 3 new detections we found here last year. So we saw how tiny this insect is, so how are we even able to find it and add all those points to the map? We do have a few different techniques to find hemlock woolly adelgid. Professionals can sometimes use tools like headlamps or sticky traps, so the ovisacs of hemlock woolly adelgid can sometimes be really bright and reflective. So if you shine a light on them using a headlamp, you can kind of spot them that way. The sticky traps, which are these green boards here, they can be placed underneath the tree to catch any fallen adelgids. So there is one life stage of hemlock woolly adelgid where they actually crawl around. And if they accidentally fall off, sometimes they're caught on the sticky trap. And then someone will actually sit there and look over this entire trap really closely to see if they can spot any hemlock woolly adelgid. So you can see there's a lot of stuff stuck on this trap, and it would be kind of hard to identify, but people are really good at doing it. One of the most common and probably most fun techniques is ball sampling. So surveyors will use a slingshot to shoot a ball high up in the canopy. Then as that ball falls down towards the ground, it'll pick up any of those woolly ovisacs on that attached to Velcro on the ball. These methods have been pretty effective and can sometimes be pretty time intensive though. So it takes a lot of time to go around and do all the surveying and figure out where to go. Like for the ball sampling, for example, they have to do this process several times on the same tree and then move to the next tree and cover as many trees as they can. So because of this, there are researchers that have been working to develop new tools for surveying and finding hemlock woolly adelgid. So one of these new tools, which we'll get into, involves the use of eDNA, which stands for environmental DNA. So environmental DNA is essentially genetic material shed into the environment by living or dead organisms. So for humans or animals, that could be skin cells or hair that we shed into the environment. But for hemlock woolly adelgid, we're looking specifically for things like wings, little insect legs, wool fragments, and excrement, really just any fragment of the insect or materials produced by that insect. So researchers developed this new tool using eDNA to really make hemlock woolly adelgid detection easier. This is what the trap looks like here in the orange. It was developed by Dr. Sherilyn Partridge and Meg Sanders out of Grand Valley State University in Michigan. So it's a 3D printed orange trap. It holds 4 microscope slides. And those slides are dipped in petroleum jelly. And the idea here is that this trap sits elevated off the ground to capture any hemlock woolly adelgid that have just been caught in the wind. So any hemlock woolly adelgid eDNA will stick to that jelly on the slide so that we can analyze it later. So this trap just sits there untouched for 2 months. He'll set it up and leave it. So it's a really great passive monitoring tool that lets us monitor for hemlock woolly adelgid. And it's especially helpful in areas with difficult terrain or areas where it might be difficult to get in and visually survey, where there's slopes, for example, or where there's a really dense forest. So yeah, at the end of the 2 months, our volunteers will pack up this trap. They'll send us the microscope slides that we can visually inspect it underneath the microscope, and then we'll send it to partners for genetic analysis. Oftentimes, we can actually see hemlock woolly adelgid pretty clear just in the microscope and identify it that way. But we still do need to genetically analyze it in the lab just to be 100% certain that we've actually looked at everything correctly. So these traps are really the focus of this hemlock woolly adelgid monitoring network. So far, it's been a really unique opportunity for community members to become actively involved in monitoring and stewardship of their woodlots. So these are the traps. So these are the outcomes, of that program and of setting up those traps. So in year 1, we had 50 volunteers in Ontario set up these traps. We had a really good mix of volunteers. So sometimes it was individuals setting up those traps, but sometimes it was just municipalities in general. No one needed a background in hemlock woolly adelgid or in biology to take part. All they had to do was set up the trap and walk away. So pretty easy to get involved. The program was a success because it did increase early detection. So there were 2 slides that seemed to have hemlock woolly adelgid when just visually inspecting it, But with further lab analysis, we only found one with the insect. The other slide that looked suspicious actually was installed wrong, so it just kind of messed things up a little bit. But we do have one positive detection confirmed by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And this is really great because this detection could have gone unnoticed if it wasn't for this program. And now that we found the insect there, we can start making plans to manage the site and prevent its spread further. The report also did make its way onto EDMAPS, which we talked about before. So this just means that anyone now looking at hemlock woolly adelgid on those reporting tools can see this new detection. This is the detection here that we were able to add to the map because of this program. So this is Haldimand County where we had that positive trap, and now we're able to start management techniques because we know it's there. So hopefully we can now start to kind of limit the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid out of this area. So thankfully, we've been able to expand the program here in year two because it's such the high demand for monitoring. So this year, we were able to launch 50 additional traps in Ontario. So there were 100 total on the landscape, since the people that participated last year also chose to participate and redeploy their traps this year. We were also able to expand into other provinces. So now we have traps set up in the East Coast where hemlock woolly adelgid has also been spotted. It hasn't been confirmed in Prince Edward Island or in Quebec, but it's good to have it there just in case, and that way hopefully we can catch it early if it does happen to make its way there. We do hope to continue this program and offer even more traps in the future. So if you have a parent or a friend that owns land with lots of hemlocks, or if your school is surrounded by these trees, then maybe consider reaching out and we can get you involved in this program. So shifting gears here a little to our beech leaf disease monitoring network. This is a newer program for us. We just launched it a few months ago, actually, but it's a really easy one for you and anyone you know to get directly involved with. The point of this program is really to identify and report beech leaf disease so we can learn more about it. So beech leaf disease is thought to be caused by an invasive nematode that feeds on beech leaves. These nematodes can really damage all species of beech trees. So American, European, Chinese, Oriental beech are all susceptible to the disease. It can seriously weaken trees and in some cases even kill the beech. So these are the nematodes. They're a microscopic animal that kind of looks and moves like a worm. These nematodes are present in leaves before symptoms occur, and they'll feed on the leaf tissue between the veins, causing leaf damage. So you can see here in this picture that how the leaves have these kind of bands of yellow and green, and this is where the nematodes are actually feeding, but they're just so small you can't see. These nematodes can cause leaf deformity in beech trees of all ages, but they do tend to be worse in younger trees. So this map shows the distribution of beech leaf disease based on the most up-to-date surveys in the United States and here in Canada. So it was first introduced to North America in 2012 in Ohio, which we can see in that very light yellow color right along the shore of Lake Erie. But it has spread out since then to a lot of different states and even here into Ontario. So it was first found in Ontario in 2017 and then again has spread out since. All the areas in red are the counties where it spread last year. So we can see it moving more north and south, kind of all along the distribution. And last year we did see it pop up in 4 new counties here in Ontario. Everything in green on this map to the right shows the native range of beech trees in North America. And we can see that beech leaf disease is spreading quite quickly throughout this range. It's not everywhere throughout this range yet, but it does have the potential to keep spreading further and further. So a big role of community scientists in this program is to know how to identify beech leaf disease. So this is what it looks like here at the top there. There's 3 different pictures. The most distinctive feature of beech leaf disease are those dark stripes or bands between the veins of the leaves. This banding is really easy to see when looking at the leaves from below and allowing the sunlight to pass through the leaf tissue. So if you're walking on a sunny day, and you might be able to see it better when you're looking up from the street below. These bands can look different depending on the time of year. So sometimes they're slightly reddish right after the leaves pop out at the beginning of the growing season, but get darker over time. In severe cases too, we'll see thickened or leathery leaves that might start to curl or deform. Sometimes it can be pretty tricky to spot, especially on a tree that doesn't have as many nematodes. So the first picture there on the left, there are bands that are a little more subtle, and it's something that you might not even notice as you're walking through the forest, especially just compared to the other pictures where we see it in more severe cases. If you ever see something and you're not totally sure it's invasive, just make sure you send a report in anyway. It could be out of the ordinary and you're just not sure. You're like, this looks weird on the tree. I don't normally see this. Make a report. Even if you're not 100% sure what it is, it's better just to be safe than sorry. So this type of banding system will be visible right away in the spring after the leaves start coming out. So you can notice it pretty early in the season. These nematodes are present in the leaf buds all throughout the winter. So they're already damaging those leaves before they even emerge in the spring, unfortunately. Sometimes we can also see early leaf drop and canopy thinning, which reduces photosynthesis, so the trees can't produce as much energy or food, which really weakens them. And again, sometimes it can cause their death as well. So this really shows the variation in symptoms. So the leaf on the far left came from a tree that is only newly infected, so there's less nematodes there feeding on the tissue. We can see like a very faint banding. The leaf on the far right came from a very heavily infested tree with lots more nematode activity. So we know that based on the darker and the more severe banding and because of how the leaf is curling. So beech leaf disease is tricky because we don't know much about it, especially just compared to other forest invaders. It just hasn't really been here long enough for us to totally understand how it works. There's a lot of ongoing research, though, to really better understand its impacts, its pathways of spread, best management practices, things like that. It's still even unknown if the nematode itself is the only cause of beech leaf disease. So we know it's definitely associated with it, but we don't really know if there's any other organisms that are also playing a part. We do know some of the risk factors and know that these nematodes prefer water and moisture, so they tend to be found more on trees that are growing closer to the water. Other types of nematodes do move in water, so we're thinking that that's probably the case for these ones too. But again, there just needs to be more research. So to help researchers and us just better understand the disease, we're asking community scientists like yourself to report any beech leaf disease that you see. We've actually turned into a little contest just to make it a little bit more interesting. So all you have to do is join the iNaturalist project and report any cases of beech leaf disease. So we've talked about EDMAPS as a reporting tool before, but this particular contest will be through iNaturalist. So just in case you haven't been familiar with that, iNaturalist is another really great reporting tool, but it's a little bit more general. So if you're a nature enthusiast, it might be good because you can report both invasive and native species. So it makes it a good tool for learning more about the species and nature just around you in general. EDMAPS, which we learned about before, is exclusively for reporting invasive species. So if that's where your interest lies, that might be a better tool for you. But for this particular contest, if you submit a report of beech leaf disease before the end of November, you'll be automatically entered for a chance to win the Community Science Monitoring Prize Pack, which has a ton of goodies, including a custom Yeti. So you can check it out by scanning this QR code here, but all the information is available on our website as well. And yes, your reports can win you a fun prize, but it's also helping contribute really valuable information. So we're pretty limited right now with our knowledge on where beech leaf disease is currently found. So your reports can really make a difference in helping us understand the disease better. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody. So there are a lot of different ways you can become a community scientist, but the last one I'll talk about here today is participating in local events. So we've hosted many different plant polls to help manage invasive species and invasive plants. So we'll put a call out for volunteers, then we'll have a meet site and we'll all meet and really just start pulling out these heavily infested areas to get rid of some of the invasive plants. So this one here is called garlic mustard. It actually gets its name because of its smell. So if you rip off a leaf and crush it between your fingers, you should smell garlic. Garlic mustard is actually known to be one of Ontario's most aggressive invaders in the forest because of how quickly it can spread and take over an area. So you can see here that in the photo on the right, garlic mustard is the only plant that's growing there. It's completely crowded out all the other plants and wildlife so that nothing else can grow. Thankfully, smaller infestations of this plant can be easier to manage on your own or with your class because it's easy to pull out of the ground. So with hand pulling, all you would do is grab an individual plant, pull it out of the ground while making sure that you got the entire root just to avoid resprouting. And then you would pop it into a black garbage bag. We don't compost these plants after we pull them, especially if they're seeds, because the plant could keep growing and spread into new areas. So what we do is we put them into a black garbage bag, we seal it up really tightly, and then we'll typically leave them in the sun for about a week. That way everything can dry out and kind of kill any of the plant material. And then we just simply throw the bags away. So we do this a lot with garlic mustard. And we do a similar pulling and disposal technique for Himalayan balsam. So this is another invasive plant. And this one was actually initially introduced to North America because people thought it would be pretty to plant in gardens, and it is pretty, but the plant was able to grow beyond those gardens and spread into other areas. So now it's pretty widely distributed across Canada and can be found in 8 different provinces. So this plant can form really dense patches that crowd out those native species and reduce biodiversity. So you can see here in that picture on the right, with Himalayan balsam, it can grow really tall. It can get about 3 meters in height. And with them being so tall and dense, you can imagine how little sunlight is actually reaching beneath them. So nothing is able to really grow below them. So because we have a lot of staff members in Sault Ste. Marie, we're able to do a lot of public events up there just to get people involved. Last year, we focused pretty heavily on Himalayan balsam and hosted 7 different plant pools in total in the Sault Ste. Marie area. We really tried to get as many people involved as possible. So we collaborated with 9 different local organizations and engaged with over 200 volunteers and other community members in person. With all this community support, we were able to manage a pretty large area and remove almost 150 bags of Himalayan balsam, which is just a ton of plant material. You can see here just how much support we had. It really is a team effort to tackle invasive species. We've done a lot of these different plant pool events now and have really figured out kind of the best ways to go about it and what you need to consider. So if you're ever interested in hosting one, maybe with your class or figuring out how to get involved in one in your area, just please reach out. We'd be happy to help with that. We also post a lot of these types of events on our website under the events tab. So if you're ever curious about different things being hosted in the area or across the province, you can check that out too. So I'll just kind of wrap up here by sharing some resources that we have at the Invasive Species Center in case you want to learn more about invasive species or ways to get involved. I'll start by saying that we have a few different newsletters that share upcoming events or invasive species news, so please feel free to sign up for those on our website. We also have a ton of different fact sheets on a variety of topics that are all free to download. So these can be really good summaries of what you need to know about a particular invasive or topic. We have fact sheets about some of the species we talked about today, but we also have more general ones like about climate change or prevention, things like that. We also have species profiles on our website, which are little deep dives into particular species. So you can learn more about a species life cycle, how it spreads, how to prevent it, manage it, all things like that. We also have resources built into the different profiles, so you can access the fact sheets there or other types of guidelines. But we do have profiles like this for basically all types of taxa, so hopefully there's something in there for everybody that's of interest. We also have a monthly webinar series where we invite an expert guest to speak about issues or topics related to invasive species. So you can go to our YouTube channel to watch any of those previous videos, but you can also check out our events page on our website to sign up for any of the upcoming webinars as well. I wanted to highlight our invasive species forum. We host this virtually every year. It's a free annual event that brings attention to invasive species issues, research, and advances in prevention and management. We have sessions about all types of invasives. So we'll have a forest invasive session, but if plants or aquatic animals are your thing, then we'll also have sessions for that. We do have also sessions about tons of different things like new technology, new policies, community involvement, and more. So something for everybody. Registration will go live soon. So just keep an eye out on our website to sign up and attend that next year from February 18th to the 20th. And again, it's totally free to watch. The last thing I'll touch on is our community science tree check form. This is an online form that can be used to monitor the health of your neighborhood trees. So if you're out walking around, you can act as a community scientist by making reports on this form. This form will give you a bunch of prompts for things to look for, and it's not necessarily for invasive species exclusively. You can actually make reports about a completely healthy tree with this form. And this type of information is still really useful because knowing invasive species, where they are and where they aren't, is still really important data for just understanding distributions. Oops. So yeah, this is really just a form that you can think about using in the future to better understand forest health and get more involved as a community scientist. Okay, so that's it for me. I think I ended a little bit early here, but I'm totally open to questions if you have any. I'll leave my email on the screen here as well, so people can write it down. Feel free to email me anytime. I'm happy to get back to you.
Thanks, Madison. That was great. I feel like I learned a lot. And we actually did have a few questions pop up in the chat already. So I'll start with one from Nina. She was curious because she said in the Ottawa area, a lot of the kind of woodlots have been overtaken by invasive plants like lily of the valley, goutweed, garlic mustard, buckthorn. And they were wondering if there are any sort of training opportunities online or in person to help them become more comfortable doing removals, or if you have kind of recommendations for how they might go about establishing a removal program in their area.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a really great question. We do have an invasive I should have actually put in my slides here. We do have an invasive species training program on our website. So there are courses that you can take to learn more about that sort of thing. I'm actually writing one about plants, like the ones that you've mentioned now, to kind of give people a better idea of, yeah, what resources are available to them, how you would actually go about managing them. So that should be coming out sometime next year. But we do have a lot of those types of resources on our website as well. There's also, I don't have it right next to me, but we do have on our website a grow me instead guide too. There's as a, it just kind of reminded me. So if you are planting and doing some gardening, you can refer to that guide to look at which plants you should be planting versus which ones you shouldn't. Because things like goutweed that you mentioned, that was planted in gardens. Just, I mean, it's sold in stores and people just don't know that it's invasive because it's being sold. So we have guides like that to really help you distinguish which plants you should be using in the future.
Awesome. I think I found your training link and put it into the chat.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Ellen.
It looks like a very long, weird, insane URL. But I also found the Grow Me Instead guide too, which I know is a good one for selecting native plants. I know like my house backs on the trail and the garlic mustard, the goutweed, few
Yeah.
more, it's none of it's native.
Oh, yeah. They're good at creeping in too. And then it just
For
becomes your problem.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering too if maybe the best management practices would be useful, just because I know like you mentioned garlic mustard, which is great to pull and anyone can do it, but I know that like if you do it at the wrong time of year, you're more likely to spread the seeds, right? So,
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great point. We do have best management practices on our website to go over like more in depth of the different management practices and like the time of year you should be doing things, what things you maybe shouldn't be considering. It goes into all of that. So we do have a whole section of that on our website. And a lot of it's also on our species profiles. There's a whole management section in each one of those as well.
okay. Yeah, so definitely excellent to check that out because I also know that like buckthorn, some of the best management practices involve herbicides. So that's not something your average
Yeah.
person is
No,
going to be able to have access to as well.
exactly. Yeah.
All right. We did have one other one too already. And if anyone has questions, keep them coming. One person mentioned I use INAT to report invasive species. Should I also be reporting to EDD maps or do they integrate in any way?
That's another great question. Yeah, they're actually everything's all connected on the back end. So if you report something to iNaturalist and it's invasive, it will eventually make its way over to EdMaps and then it'll become public on their distribution maps as well. So it's kind of easy for whatever platform you prefer, it will really end up where it should be end up.
All
And
right,
then
yeah. So the
like yeah, and then like sorry, government like CFIA, they're connected with EdMaps as well. So things of high priority, like oak wilts that I mentioned or spotted lanternfly, they will make their way up to people that actually make the decisions and initiate action.
okay. Great. We'll give it a minute 'cause we got about maybe 10 left in the session to see if any other questions pop up. I know some people have had to leave. I know I wrote a note down actually though, because you were talking about beech leaf disease, which was a new one for me. And then made me think I was like, beech bark disease is also one I've heard about. So are we like extra concerned about our beech trees right now?
Yeah, I know. Beech trees are just going through it. Yeah, beech bark disease and beech leaf disease both do impact beech. I don't personally know too much about beech bark disease, but I know that yeah, trees can have both of them. So it can be a concern for sure.
All right, and then I guess I was wondering, you mentioned a few priority species, likely the ones that you brought up in the presentation, like spotted lanternfly and oak wilt. Are there any priority invasive species you really want to flag for the group that's here, just to be like, this is, if you're going to pick one to try and learn about or focus on, this is
Yeah.
where we're most concerned.
That's a hard question because
Yeah.
there are a few. I tried to highlight our most important ones, like hemlock woolly adelgid and beech leaf disease through our monitoring networks. Personally, I do a lot of work with oak wilt, so maybe I should have had a little slide on that about that. But it is a new tree disease here in Canada. Like I said, it was found for the first time last year. And so far, we've managed all of the sites. So there's nothing currently on the landscape. There's been ongoing surveys by, different municipalities and by the government. We haven't found anything yet again. But again, it's really important that people are out and community scientists are out looking for it because sometimes we'll spot things that maybe other people don't. So that would be another one to really look for.
We had a question pop in from Ruth. She was wondering if there are any initiatives or organizations that are working to pressure governments to intervene and stop the sale of invasive species. I think likely at nurseries. I know those are a big point of
Mhm.
introduction. Are you aware of any initiatives like that?
I'm not aware of any initiatives. I know like ourselves and a lot of our partners really just focus on the outreach portion of it. So we try to educate people on how to make those, good purchases and how to do that. And to try and educate people on what's invasive and what's not. So we're doing a lot from the education perspective. I don't know about any initiatives that are pushing more from the policy perspective. I'm sure there are some out there. I'm not currently aware of any though.
I would think maybe the Ontario Invasive Plant Council would
They
be a
might
good
have
place to
some.
start looking because that's definitely very focused for them since they're invasive plants within
Oh yeah,
Ontario.
they're all about it. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely a good recommendation. Yeah.
Okay. And then yeah, there's about 10 minutes. Just seeing if any other questions pop in. Lots of great messages in the chat about organizations that are doing outreach and like poll initiatives, like Toronto Nature Stewards, and some Port Elgin area youth. I know there's like Huron Coastal Center that does a lot of like community science with youth in the area. So if you're aware of any programs that you want to share or push, feel free to put them in the chat. Madison, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to kind of wrap up thoughts or
Yeah.
if you spoken your piece.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear about all the different organizations doing action. It's really gives me a lot of hope to see, more things happening with on the ground action. But yeah, I don't have anything else to add really. Like I said, we have a lot of resources on our website. We're always really happy to help answer any questions you have moving forward. So you can either email me, which I have up here, or we have an info line. So you can always email that as well. But always here to answer any questions.
Awesome. And if for some reason you misplaced Madison's email, you can always reach out to us at Forest Ontario as well, and we can make the connection as needed. So thanks everyone for taking the time to join us. Thanks, Madison, for a very informative presentation. I hope everyone's feeling empowered to go out and start their community science journey because there's definitely a lot of programs and a lot of value, and we appreciate everyone's eyes on the ground.
Absolutely.